here's our website, strongtowns.org. I'm going to tell you something right now that a lot of people don't realize. We have licensed all of our stuff on our site under a Creative Commons license. What that means, if you look at it, is that we tell you you can use it however it benefits you. We are trying to get a message out. So if there's something on our site that we have done that you find particularly insightful, not only are you allowed to copy it and distribute it, not only are you allowed to share it, you're allowed to take it and put your name on it as if you are the brilliant person who wrote it, right? We are trying to change our culture. We're trying to change our conversation. And so we invite you to take our stuff and share it with others. In fact, if anything that I've done today or we've done as a group is inspiring to you, the number one thing you can do for us is to share our content. We are a member organization. We have half of our budget supported by members. We do not, at this point, get any foundation donations. We're not driven by any major donors. After the election, there were all kinds of people coming to our site going, who's paying you guys? We make our money in two ways. One, doing workshops like this, and two, from our members. If you are interested in supporting us, we welcome you to become a member of the organization.
Question, we've got 3 cities in Barron County that have embarked on the placemaking, all right? One's Main Street, 2 are connected communities now, and all of them are doing great, in their own way. The programs are totally different from each other, but the one common thing you brought up is a challenge, and you gave some tools here, is the sexiness of that $14 million project going out to the airport versus the incremental stuff you can do in the neighborhoods.
Yeah. I think it's really hard, and I've seen a lot of cities embark on the placemaking, and to me it's like, okay, good, I'm enthused about it, but I think we have to step back and understand that it's the problems that we face today were not because the people in the past were stupid or because we're smarter today. The problems in the past are really a byproduct of us thinking and believing that we knew the answers. So even amongst my placemaking friends, I get a little bit uptight sometimes because they will go in and say, we shouldn't be building the highway out on the edge and running the sewer and water, but we should be spending $14 million putting decorative brick and decorative lights and recreating something here. What I'm suggesting is that we're in a weird place. I'm not going to stand up here and tell you that I know what the cities of the future will look like. I just know that what we have now is not viable, and something's going to change. Detroit is really a model, but I don't think it's destiny for all of us. I think we'll all have a different approach. And so by thinking and working incrementally, by really focusing on that, what's the next smallest thing we can do, I think we can go a long ways. Now, culturally, it's really hard. One of the things that we did in Brainerd was we set up this contest where we said, 20 people come in. If you have an idea for making the neighborhood better, we'll give you $100 to go out and do that idea. And the idea was we would get 20 ideas, and we would take the best ones, and then we would give them a little bit more money. And then the next round, give them a little bit more until we ended up with one person that we were going to give $4,000 to. I started talking to my dad about this. And my dad said, that's really stupid. Because someone's going to take your $100 and they're going to go out and they're going to put Christmas tree lights on their house and they're going to say, look, I made the neighborhood better. And I don't think he was grasping the fact that that was actually a good investment. Because I spent $100 to realize that that was not the person I wanted to give $4,000 to, right? The problem we have is that cities are made up of my dad, right? So when you go out and do placemaking and you do experimental things, even when they cost like little sums of money, people show up and they get irate. I see my city spend $400 on a bike rack and draw 10 people to the council meeting to get, we're on tape, to get angry about that. But we spend $14 million on a waste of a project that will never amount to anything but a cash suck, nobody shows up. Nobody. That's a cultural problem. And the only way we get over that is by changing our mindset of what makes a good government investment. If we looked at Google and we saw Google who went out one day and said, you know what, we have this great idea, it's called autonomous car, we're going to put $5 billion into it. Investors would freak out. That's not what they did, right? They put money into Google Maps, and they put money into AI technology, and they put a little bit of money here and there. And what happened is that out of the thousands of little tiny bets they tried, the automated car kind of rose up to the top because it combined a whole bunch of other things. We look at businesses as brilliant that way. When Apple puts out their new iPhone, you get like release 1 and then release 2 and then release 3. We don't show up at Apple headquarters and slam our phone on the ground and say, am I paying you for this or what? But at city councils, we're not allowed to do release 1, release 2, release 3. We have to do a finished product that's perfect. And what that does is it puts us in a defensive mindset. We kill things by committee. We create a big enough cluster mess of a project where nobody is really responsible and everybody collectively is to blame. So I think it's important for us to understand that there's a shift that needs to happen between this horizontal growth machine and actual what I think people would call placemaking. But there's a corresponding shift in our culture that needs to happen where we allow and embrace the idea of incremental experimentation as a way to discern what a good investment is. Please, anybody else? Please tell me that we had not reached a point where nobody has a comment or a question. Because I don't know any jokes. Go ahead.
So of all the cities that you visited, worked with, are there any cities that stand out to you as being, just better examples of following these principles, strong towns?
Thank you for asking that question in that way. Here's the way I usually get that question. And I try not to be prickly and defensive. I usually get that, years ago, not so much anymore, but years ago, I had this one antagonist that would follow me around Minnesota. Like I would go, there would be 5 people in the audience and her, everywhere I went. And in the early days, one time I drove 6 hours to Bismarck, North Dakota, and I gave this talk to 2 people. And I thought it was a success. She didn't follow me there, but she would follow me to all these places. And her question, a variation on yours, was, okay, Chuck, you're so smart. Where are all the strong towns? How come you figured out something nobody else has? It's really hard today because our cities are stuck in this mode. And it's a mode that after World War II, we were all encouraged to do. The federal subsidies, the state subsidies, the way we finance growth and development out of Wall Street, Fannie, Freddie, there's this whole long list of things that have created incentives for us to do what we have done. So we are all fragile in the same way. There are cities that are dealing with it differently that I find very unique. On one end of the spectrum, you have a place like Detroit, which essentially is not dealing with it or dealing with it, I think, very ineffectively at the local government level, but at the level below that of the neighborhood is doing breathtakingly amazing things. If you want to see what American pioneer spirit looks like, go to Detroit. You have young people who are going there, buying houses for $10,000, putting another $10,000 into fixing them up, and living really great lifestyles in these kind of clusters of people who are in the same bend. It's a very low burn lifestyle. It's not one where you need to make $80,000 a year. It's one where you can, rent out a room, have a little garden, do some side work, and be just fine. It's a different version of America. I think it's fascinating. You can look at cities like Memphis, which are not quite at that point, but are doing a lot of things like the Broad Street Project, where it is taking neighborhoods that have long been neglected and putting incremental amounts of money into them to bring them back. Memphis has a very strong racial component to that, and so their cultural conversation has been a little bit different. They don't go in and say, these are high return investments. They go in and say, these are neighborhoods that have been neglected for cultural reasons, and we're going to now stop that and kind of reverse that. But the result is the same. They're making really great incremental investments. There are governments such as a county I worked with in Florida, Martin County. Memphis is doing this to a degree. You see this in Fort Worth and also in Lafayette, where they're trying to change the way their government is organized. So it's less about silos and hierarchies and more about teams. So instead of saying, this is an engineering project, and then it enters the black hole vortex of the engineering department and gets spit out at the end as something we all hate, it goes to a project team that includes all kinds of technical and non-technical professionals, as well as neighborhood people and the like. And what comes out is a more well-rounded, slower, messier, but more well-rounded project delivery process. I'm very inspired by that. And you see places like Lancaster, California, where I've been excited to go to a couple of times, where they have made some strategic investments. They're a very suburban commuter city, and they have a suburban commuter mentality. But they also are aware of this Ponzi scheme and how their clock is ticking. And because of that, they've taken essentially the wealth that they have, and they've invested it in some key investments in making their downtown functional and viable. Whether that translates into, I think, the next thing, which is to connect it to the neighborhoods and make that viable, is an open question, but they're at least asking the right questions. So we have we have a discussion board, a Slack channel, that now I think we're approaching like 1,000 people on it. There are discussions going on in every state and cities all over the country of people trying to figure this out. I'll repeat what I said earlier. I'm not going to stand up here and pretend I have a 5-step plan or I know the answer. I just think we have to start asking more nuanced, difficult questions on the ground level. And there's a whole collection of people that are associated with us that are starting to do that. Please.
Do you by chance have any strategies in dealing with commercial property owners that own multiple buildings that care less if they're vacant after 10 years?
Yes. You have a property tax here in Wisconsin. Property tax is essentially a slumlord inducement tax. Property tax is one of the worst tax structures you can have. As an alternative, a lot of cities are starting to move towards a land tax. In Pennsylvania, you see cities that have had this option for a long time have very exciting outcomes today. What's the difference between a land tax and a property tax? In very simple terms, when we set tax rates, basically we are taxing as a percentage of, in this state, your total property value. So the land plus whatever improvements you've made. And when the city goes through that process, they'll set their levy. That then gets apportioned based on what your land is worth compared to everybody else, or what your property is worth compared to everybody else, and you'll get assessed a tax in that way. The land tax works the exact same way, except instead of apportioning it based on your total property value, it only apportions it based on your underlying land value. Let me explain in a very simple way how this works. If you own a parking lot, or you own a piece of land of the same exact size with a building on it, today, in a property tax, the building owner will pay many, many, many multiples of what the empty parking lot will pay in taxes. Under a land tax, they would pay the same. They would pay the same. There's some logic to this. The snowplow doesn't stop when it reaches the vacant lot and then, put down on the other side. Your sidewalk runs across them. Your sewer and water runs across them. There's some logic to this. But what's really more important are the incentives behind it. Right now, with a property tax, your incentive is to not have your property value increase because that increases your taxes. And if you own derelict property, if you are a slumlord, if you're, buying properties, converting them to rentals, and then riding the decline down, all you care about is the cash flow. And your cash flow is improved, the lower the values become. The optimum strategy for someone owning a vacant lot in a property tax system is to hold the lot at very low holding costs, so very low cash flow demand. I get my taxes as low as I can. I have everybody around me do the hard work of improving the property, and then I be the last one to sell at a premium value. The land tax works the opposite way. The land tax says we're all in this together. And your taxes are only going to go up if this neighborhood improves and all the land values go up. But until then, we're all here. And you can go out and make your property better. You can improve it, you can invest in it, and you won't pay a dime more in taxes than the guy next door. And so what it does is instead of punishing investment, it punishes disinvestment. If we look at taxes as rewards and punishments, a land tax rewards investment and punishes disinvestment. A property tax rewards disinvestment and punishes investment. So the greatest thing that we can do to get those properties off the sideline is actually change the underlying tax structure. I realize you can't do that, but we can do that.
Have you heard of the shame-based approach?
Shame-based approach?
Yeah.
I believe in shame as a strong motivating factor. I think part of, boy, I could talk about this for hours. One of the things that I think we have seen in the last election and in multiple election cycles recently is that we have, and Bill Bishop has written a book called The Big Sort. It talks about how we have self-sorted into kind of areas of like-minded people. It has tended to make our thoughts, our culture homogenous at the local level. We have less cultural diversity. In some cities, we have more diversity in the way that we like to describe it as Americans. We have people of different ethnicities, different backgrounds, different orientations. But we have less thought diversity than ever before. Our neighborhoods, our cities have less thought diversity than ever. And it has had a huge impact on shame. That's where it's actually shown up at the local level a lot. Because you used to have social pressures from kind of a broader palette, and now you only have social pressures from a narrow palette. So if we kind of, as a group, agree that something is acceptable, we will turn a blind eye to craziness because we don't have anyone in our community that's raising that issue. I believe strongly at the local level that shame is a very strong motivator. And on the flip side of that, we can also look at, and I'm trying to think of the word. The word that comes to mind is bravado. But when we go back and look at historic cities, the great buildings, the ornamentation, the fountain in the park, all this stuff, these were not Rotary projects in the past. These were not public projects in the past. This was like the wealthy benefactor saying, look at how great I am. And the funny thing is that, we kind of shun that today to a degree. We might applaud Bill Gates for investing in AIDS in Africa or malaria or what have you. But we make it really hard for the local philanthropists to do like the great thing here today. That was a natural byproduct of a successful place. We expected the wealthy in our community to do things to make our community better for everybody. And we allowed them to name the fountain after themselves, right? So shame and braggadocio, I don't know what the opposite of it would be as a human. I think those are really powerful forces that we should not be afraid to mobilize. Please.
You talked about how off-street parking in particular has a pretty low property value and reduces walkability and things like that.
Let's say all that, yeah.
And so I guess our city council recently created, just on a very narrow vote, like higher parking minimums for apartment buildings, which is not really the direction that most cities are going. So
Right.
what do you think should be done about parking minimums as a zoning rule?
Well, as a zoning rule, parking minimum should be non-existent. We should not have parking minimums. I think there's two ways to look at parking, and both of them go along with a capitalist free market kind of mindset. The way number one is on private property. And I guess I kind of default to the notion of if property owners feel like the best use of their land is a parking lot, I may not like that, but that's really reflective on what we have created as a city. I'm certainly not going to mandate that they subsidize drivers. I would be more of a, let's let people, let's not we don't force private property owners to subsidize any other aspect of people's lives. Why do we force them to subsidize people's driving? That seems like when we think of a bootstrap mentality, that's just another burden and obstacle we put in people's way. When we get to the public sector side, it's even, I think, more nefarious. Why are we collectively subsidizing one set of actions over another? In a city, parking should always be paid. There should be no free parking, because parking is not free. You're all paying for it. You're paying enormous sums of money for it. Would you rather pay this through your taxes, kind of in a backhanded, very expensive, non-market responsive way? Or would you rather pay for it directly? To me, I would rather pay for it directly. If that parking spot, if I'm in a downtown and that parking spot is costing me $20,000 a spot every 2 decades, which is not an unreasonable sum of money for a parking spot, why are we paying for that? Why are we paying for that? Now, the hard question becomes, you can philosophically agree with me there, but the hard question becomes, how do we transition? Because right now we have a fragile ecosystem in our downtowns that is essentially dependent on parking. How do we move from that situation to a stronger, more robust ecosystem that is not dependent on parking? And that is where your downtown strategy needs to expand to become a downtown and surrounding neighborhood strategy. Because what needs to happen is that over time, you need to replace people who would drive to your downtown with people who would walk to your downtown. And if a person who walks to downtown needs a $2,000 sidewalk improvement, that's a lot cheaper than a $20,000 parking spot. You see what I'm saying? We can start to make that transition. And so, incremental again, as we incrementally improve our downtown, more businesses, small, converting our parking lots into small startup things, it would provide more offerings and more reasons to go downtown. At the same time, we make small incremental investments to improve the ability of people who live near the downtown to get there. And understand, walking and biking is a spectrum. There are people who will walk and bike in the most despotic of circumstances because they insist on walking and biking. There are people who you could make, you could be in Walt Disney World with no cars and it's all like this massive pedestrian walking environment and they will not walk, right? So there's a spectrum. And what you're trying to do is not make it so that the person who won't walk will. What you're trying to do is over time shift the spectrum so that more and more people will. And if you can improve your downtown by converting parking to higher uses, at the same time you're moving the spectrum over, what you find is that the people you lose who are no longer driving will be made up 10 times by the people who get there from the neighborhood. And the thing about the people from the neighborhood is they will come more often. Their properties will be enhanced by the enhancement here. There's a symbiotic relationship between the two. They're more loyal customers, they spend more. Everything about that is a good relationship. But we have to start with a respect for the fact that downtowns right now are very fragile, and they're very fearful of losing parking because of how fragile they are. We have to start with nudging the new patrons that way, and then start phasing out the parking. And by the way, phasing out the parking, one of the strategies needs to be a price mechanism. If you don't have a price mechanism in your downtown for parking, you have too much parking. When people are willing to pay a high price to park somewhere, you've created somewhere special, somewhere that's going to have a lot of value. And the places like that, nobody complains about parking. Nobody complains about the cost. None of the businesses do. And the way to make this transition work is to actually take the money that you would charge for parking and use it to make the downtown better. I mean, I think a lot of cities make the mistake of thinking that that's cash flow for the city. Keep that in the downtown. Use it to reinforce what you're trying to accomplish. But if you're requiring parking for apartment buildings, you're going the exact wrong way. Stop doing that. Reverse. We have a map on our site. Every year we do a Black Friday parking event. The day after Thanksgiving, the busiest, on-ground, non-e-commerce shopping day of the year, the day after Thanksgiving, we ask people around the country to go out and take pictures of their parking lots and then post them with the hashtag Black Friday Parking, just to show how on the busiest day of the year we have way too much parking. So the rest of the year we have vastly too much. On that page, we actually have a map of every city in the country that has gotten rid of their parking minimums. And 3 years ago, it was a dozen. Now it's hundreds. Hundreds. Please.
You had made a comment which I found interesting. People are an indicator of success. And one thing I hear in our region, I don't think is any different in northern Wisconsin, is we have a number of communities that are much smaller than what some examples you've given, Detroit, Memphis. There's a number of communities in the 1,000 to 5,000 population range. And
My city's 13.
Yeah. You hear employers saying, hey, we don't have enough people, we need some younger people. What are you seeing out there? What thoughts would you have on that topic to attract younger people and that? Any thoughts in that area?
I think it's really hard in cities of that size. It's really interesting what we have done to the small town. And I say interesting as a way to avoid saying tragic and devastating. There was a thing, when I was growing up, if you didn't leave home, there was something wrong with you, right?
Yep.
If when I would come back from college, at break, I'd run into my fellow classmates who were coming back from college. If you ran into someone who had not gone away, you just kind of had a sense that life wasn't working out for them. And so there's this thing about small towns where today in America, and this is very different from when my parents were kids, when blue-collar jobs were more prevalent, there was a way to essentially bootstrap and make a living. Today, because of how our national macroeconomy is structured, if you don't leave town, there's generally something that's not working. And I don't say that to disparage anyone. Maybe some of you have kids who have not left town. I'm not saying this is like a universal truth, but there's a sense that, in very small towns, you need to leave and get something before you would ever think about coming back. What that creates is this problem that we now, instead of having natural careers that people can slide into, we have this problem in small towns where we have to bring people back. And if you are an accountant, you have to actually have the accountant die or retire for you to move back and have that make sense. Because there ain't enough room in this town for the two of us, right? You're gonna have this showdown on Main Street. I'm involved in my hometown with the History Week celebration that we do once a year. And this year it's on our southeast neighborhood. Our southeast neighborhood is our traditional blue-collar neighborhood. It's next to the rail yard. In this neighborhood, there were 9 grocery stores. Today there's no, I mean, the closest grocery store is 3 miles away. There's no grocery store. There were 9 in this neighborhood back in the 1950s. We went through this long list of the, I had an elderly gentleman with me, and we were going down the street, and he was telling me what used to be in these places. I found out that there was a Finnish bath. Finnish as in not finished, like completed. Finnish as in Scandinavian ethnicity. There's a Finnish bath. And I asked him, like, what did you ever go in there? He's like, oh my gosh, no, I never would have gone in there. So it is this scandalous in some ways that I'm not quite aware of as a modern American. But we went down the street, and you start to get a sense of how the velocity of money in that community was really high, and the velocity of it exiting the community was really low. And because of that, they could support a whole lot of people that our economy today just does not support. This is a very long way of me saying that, you know, in Minnesota, we have 854 cities. I think 30 years from now, we will have less than 400. And I think a lot of those cities, you can see this in the Dakotas where they went through this really a generation ago. You see the primary industry being home building, and then the primary industry being retirement living, and then the primary industry being mortuary science, and then the primary industry being, you know, boarding up places. There's a natural thing because we can't bring people back. I don't really know how to solve that. And I feel like for our very smallest of places, it's going to be really hard to solve. Because, face it, when you're in your 20s, you're looking for someone to swap DNA with. And in a small town where you don't have a lot of job prospects and things are trending in like that direction, and you have to leave if you want to make something of yourself, the gene pool is already limited, and now it's like even more limited, right? That means you're going to meet someone who has family over here or family over there. The tie to your town is not, at that scale, is not what it used to be. I don't have a solution for that. I do think that, I've thought a lot about my city, 13,000. And this might apply to cities of 5,000, it might apply to cities of 1,000. But I think the further down you get in population, the more fragile the city is, and the more, I think, challenging it becomes. We have to figure out a way to slow down the velocity of our cities. And that is very counterintuitive to what we do today at this level. Today, everything's about efficiency. If we can get the semi in to the downtown to unload the stuff to the business and then go to the next one and the next one, we're being very efficient, hyper efficient. And the opposite of efficiency in a city is not inefficiency, it's resilience and redundancy. So efficiency, the opposite of efficiency is resilience. We actually need to create more resilience. We need to actually slow things down. So instead of money coming in and getting sucked out through Walmart, which this is not an anti-Walmart rant, but it's just describing the economic model of Walmart is to get you in a city to spend as much as you can here and get that money out as quickly as possible. The economic model of slowing things down says we need to get that money spent locally and have it passed around the community before it exits. And that is just a different emphasis. We're not emphasizing getting in and out quickly. We're not emphasizing commuting. We're emphasizing a slower speed. And I think cities that can do that have a far better shot. Understand, too, you asked a question about parking earlier. If you can have a family live in your city and go down to one car instead of two, that car expense will allow you to put $120,000 towards a home. I mean, that's how much that would be in annual payments on a mortgage. Well, in a lot of cities, small towns, houses don't even cost that much, right? So what we're really talking about is shifting existing revenue that we have in our families in ways that allow it to stick around and pass around more. That is un-American today, because whether you listen to our current president, our last president, any candidates, everything is about making our economy hyper efficient at the macro level. And what I'm saying is that we have to make our economies hyper resilient, AKA inefficient, at the local level. And to me, that's the only chance that those very small towns have. Did you have something you wanted to ask? No? I'm sorry. You had your hand earlier. You already asked something, right? So go ahead.
I'm going to push back a little bit because I sense a contradiction today.
Go ahead. I love that.
All right. So it seems like your model is based heavily on growth within with a focus on commercial. Yet you started this conversation today talking about the transition of our society to a more technical retail world, online shopping.
Okay. I don't remember mentioning online shopping, but I hear you. I'm not disagreeing with that.
How does this model work with the shift in society to be able, instead of walking down the street, pull up a piece of equipment and put it online and have it delivered to your door?
We actually have a podcast, I think, coming out today, which is a debate about the impact of Amazon. Because what you see now, and it's being reported in CNBC and Bloomberg and all the financial news, these huge amount of retail failures that we're starting to see. And the culprit they all blame, because they're on Wall Street and they don't understand what's really going on, they blame Amazon. Amazon is destroying Walmart. Walmart is a really fragile business model. I mean, Walmart is dependent on so many things going in a certain way. They're just very fragile. They're very ripe to be taken down, in a sense. And it's not, implausible to me that this whole sector would fail, because it is really the byproduct of massive public subsidies that allow it to exist in a really fragile state. I want to clarify one thing in your question, because I hope I didn't start out talking about commercial, and I hope nobody walks out of here thinking that I said downtown is like the thing you should focus on. What I try to say is that I think we have to start thinking about cities as complex ecosystems, not complicated places. And complex ecosystems are going to have commercial and residential mixed together. I think the traditional model is a good way to think of this, where you had a core downtown, which, to use modern planning terms, would be mixed use, surrounded by neighborhoods that would be deeply connected and interconnected, that would also be mixed use. The downtown may be a little more heavily commercial, the residents maybe a little bit heavily more residential, but that it would all be like an incremental spectrum. To me, in that type of a mindset, the place e-commerce fits in is very much like a faster version of the Sears Roebuck catalog. I mean, I remember reading this book about, to my kids. Anybody read the Great Brain series when they were young? You did, Jace. Yeah. You read these. These were fun books. I read this one to my daughter. I had the whole series, 8 books, and she loved them. And the one thing is they lived out in Utah, in like the middle of nowhere. And the dad was kind of an eccentric guy, and he would order crazy things like a basketball hoop from the Sears Roebuck catalog. They had the first basketball hoop in Utah. And, like, what is this? Where did it come from? It would take like 8 weeks to get there, right? As a kid growing up, I used to order my whole school wardrobe out of the JCPenney's catalog because I lived in a little town that had no place to shop. And it would show up, you'd have to order your school clothes in July if you wanted them by the start of school. And everybody would show up, and like all my friends, we'd all have the same wardrobes because we all got the mannequin in the JCPenney's catalog. I think that e-commerce can work very well in that type of a framework. We're never going to manufacture iPhones here in Eau Claire. We're probably never going to manufacture toothpaste here in Eau Claire. Maybe we will, I don't know. But the reality is that we can get those things brought in to us in a very high-tech modern way and have that flow through our lower velocity, less efficient, less hyper-stretched out, economic ecosystem, and have that make a lot of sense for us. So I don't find those things incompatible.
You started to answer my question because it was going to be, are business parks ever a good idea? But so taking that, what you just said about them potentially being part of the complex ecosystem, how can we best incorporate them in our local economy?
Business parks.
The outside, or the edge of town industrial parks.
Yeah.
Multi-acre lots.
Think through what would be in a business park. Because I can tell you, when like the business park I showed you in the example, and I went through some of the things that were there, I would say easily 4 out of 5 of those things could be with a different architectural style, not the way they are now dropped in, but with a different architectural style, could easily be in any residential neighborhood and be a good neighbor. There's a lot of, there's a survey office out there. There's the church, there's some accountants. All these things we used to fit in residential neighborhoods all over the place with no second thought given to. We just now classify them as businesses and segregated them out there. There are other ones, and there's a sandblasting business. My guess is that even if they perform stuff inside their building, they're not going to have noxious fumes. They don't have smelting plant kind of, rendering plant kind of things, which is the original advent of zoning, was to separate those things out. We don't have any of those really, but we do have a sandblasting place. My guess is maybe people would have objections to that, but historically, where were those kind of places in a city anyway? They were on the marginal piece of property out on the edge of town. And as the city grew out to it, then you got the nuisance problem. But basically, their land would get so valuable that they would just move out to the next place out on the edge. I think investing in a business park today to try to create growth is a really high-risk investment with a very low chance of reward. If you have one today and people can make use of it, by all means, but those would be the kind of places where I think ultimately are going to have a hard time being sustained. You generally have very expensive infrastructure on very large lots with very minimal tax base associated with it on a per foot basis. It might be a big dollar amount in the building, but when you look at it as a relation to the cost, it's very low. And you take that Jimmy's Pizza, where you've got a very low tax base, but you've only got 18 feet of frontage. Now all of a sudden your ratio, what it is it's a ratio of private investment to public investment. And on Jimmy's Pizza, you've got a little bit of each, but the ratio's huge. In the business park, you've got big investments, but the ratio's bad. It's often negative. We are out of time. I know we have lunch. Can we get one more, please? Would that work?
Yeah, I guess it depends how easy it is for you, but
I'll do it in a tweet.
There's concepts of gentrification, concerns for gentrification as we talk about development and redevelopment. How does that fit into your thoughts?
That's a great question. For those of you that don't know what gentrification is the idea that as a neighborhood improves, the people who were originally there can no longer afford to live there. They get kind of cast aside. I will acknowledge that this is an issue. while also kind of putting some context on it. We, as a nation, had in the 2000 census, 1,100 census tracts in the country that were in persistent poverty. And persistent poverty means the prior census, they had more than, and I want to say the number was 30%, but it's somewhere in there, percentage of their population in poverty. So you have a long history of places being impoverished, 1,100. By the time we get to the 2010 census, that number had grown from 1,100 to 3,300. On the opposite side of the spectrum, the ones where we experienced statistically gentrification, where the median incomes went up, the number of people in poverty went down, and you essentially had displacement, were numbered in the dozens, a very, very small percentage. So, is gentrification a problem? Yes, I think it's an isolated problem. But let's talk about it in these terms. When we build in large blocks and make huge leaps in our development pattern, we tend to dislocate people. So you can look at, and the cities I'm familiar with in this way, you can look at big cities like Austin, Texas, where you'll have a single family home, 20-story condo unit, luxury place. What happens is that not only is that really expensive to get in, but now you can't afford any of these either, and everybody gets booted out. The way you deal with that is you don't allow the 20-story tower. You convert the single-family home to a duplex, the other single-family home to a unit with an accessory apartment out back. You build incrementally. And when you build incrementally, what happens is that instead of having your city have development spikes, you get more of like a thickening up of a shag carpet over a broad area. And that tends to have far less dislocation pressure, and actually, I say this, I think as a positive social outcome, but not as like the motivation. What it does is it distributes the wealth being created over a broader subsection of people. So more people share in the wealth of the community growing. So build incrementally. That's the way we deal with that.